Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I'm Kerry Baldwin, guest hosting for this episode. You can check out my other podcasts called Dare to Think and the Reformed Libertarians podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Today we have a special guest, Andrew Kern, who is the founder and president of the Circe Institute and co-author of the book Classical Education, The Movement Sweeping America. Welcome, Andrew.
Good to be here. Nice to be able to talk with people who love freedom.
Yes, indeed. Before we jump into our wonderful discussion, I'd like to give you some time to just introduce yourself and let our audience know who you are and why you're here.
Right. Well, I'm Andrew Kern, president and CEO of the Circe Institute, founder. We formed in 2001 as Circe stands for Center for Independent Research on Classical Education. So we're a research institute driven by the question, what is classical education and why should we do it? And then how? It also stands for Consulting and Integrated Resources for Classical Educators. More importantly, I'm a grandfather. I will be having my 11th or 12th grandchild in March. I say I will be having. My daughter will be giving birth to. And so I'm very excited about that. And that's the most important thing about me. Married to one wife, father of 5 children, and parent of somewhere between 10 and 13 grandchildren.
Awesome. Wonderful. That is such good news.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And you did introduce the Circe Institute just a little bit, so I appreciate that. I do want to ask you, though, why did you establish the Circe Institute?
Yeah. So in 1993, I had a 5-year-old son, and we were trying to figure out how to educate him. And I will just bluntly state that the way it was being done was incredibly unsatisfying to me, the way conventional education is being done. And my wife and I talked a lot about, well, what are we going to do instead? And I don't want to overstate this too much, but this is a true statement. So I was young, you can take it accordingly. Everything that was being done about education in the conventional approach was something I wanted to avoid. And so I looked for other foundations, and that ended up leading us to first to homeschooling, and then secondly to classical education. This was back in 93. So it was a brand new thing in terms of a movement, right? If we think of it as a movement. Back then, that movement was maybe 5 or 10 schools. And so, of course, then we started a school, and that meant I had to ask, well, what have I done? My disposition is to try to figure things out after they happen.
Yeah.
After I've done them. And so I asked, well, what really is classical education? And as I'm a Christian, and so why would a Christian go for classical education? And that inquiry has been driving me since 1990, really even before then, to be honest, but since 1993 formally. So when I was asked to write a book about the movement, about the classical movement, this was 96, I formed this research institute so that I could ask, again, what is classical education? Why would a Christian do it? Who's doing it? What are some of the variations on it? What is it? How should it be? All those questions have been driving me and the Circe Institute ever since then. I should add just quickly that formally, Circe became a specific not-for-profit in 2002. So from 96 to 2002, it was Circe Ministries, and then it became, technically speaking, my full-time job in a research institute.
Gotcha. Yeah. So just so that the audience is aware, my day job currently is working at an Acton Academy, which also asked that same question. The founders, Jeff and Laura Sandifer, asked that same question. What are we doing with conventional education? Why is it failing our kids? And they also started a school. This seems to be a repeatable pattern. Parents will parents will come across the fact that conventional education is failing and try to come up with something. And this is sort of the path that is typically taken, I think. Let me ask you this. We had talked briefly offline a few weeks ago. Before we jump into the question, what is classical education? What does it mean to be educated?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. I would have to say that I've been strongly influenced on this by C.S. Lewis, if only because he opened up to me a very long tradition on education. So when I think about education, I'm thinking about what did Plato mean? What did Aristotle mean? What did the church fathers mean? What did the ancients mean? What did they mean in the Enlightenment and Renaissance? And the one thing that is consistently the case until the 19th century is that education, the way I put it is a summative way of putting it is education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. It's not training for a job. Right? There's a distinction they always made between training for a job and education. They didn't, and I would never say you shouldn't get training for a job. They obviously,
right?
If you need one, you should get training for a job. But that's not education. Education is the cultivation of your humanity, of the divine image within you. And so that means it has a strong focus on the things that distinguish us from the animals, if I can put it that way. Any animal can make its own house. Not any animal, but most animals make their own houses, get their own food, and so on. What they don't do is tell their family history. Right? No parrot, even though parrots can parrot language, no parrot has ever told its children about its father. No parrot has ever written about his ancestors and how they got there. That's a distinctly human thing. So the study of history would be an example, but the use of language is distinctly human. The use of mathematics, the sense of intellectual proportion, the sense of propriety, artistry, right? Those are the things that make up an education in the long tradition, really of any culture, but I would say particularly in the Western world, in the Greco-Christian world, Greco-Hebraic Christian world, that sense of distinctly human things like language, mathematics, the arts, fine arts, and so on.
So then what makes education classical?
Yeah, well, again, a great question. I think at this point today in time, the distinction is probably the one I made between training for a job and education to be human. I would say that from the late 19th century onward, what you encounter in Western education, and really perhaps mostly initially in American education, is it's all about fitting into the economy. The progressive drive to fit into the economy, and the naive arrogance. Can I use that combination of words? I say arrogance carefully. I don't mean it like these people were just nasty arrogant, but they were naive, and that made them arrogant. The sense that they could predict the future economy, right? That you go to school for 12 years so that you can work in a factory. Lo and behold, the factories have moved over to China. Or you go to school for 12 years so that you can learn how to computer code. Lo and behold, AI is doing all the computer coding. Right. So this notion that you're training a child for the economy, that's a very different thing. And when I'm feeling feisty, the way I put it is the goal of a classical education is to not need a job, right? In other words, you're so self-governing, and you are so able to rule yourself that your needs are minimal. But if you have needs, and if you have to feed a community, you are so good at leading and guiding and communicating that you are able to bring a harmony about in which all the members of the community provide for each other. And so in that sense, I know it's a silly way to put it, but in that sense, it's to not need a job. I don't mean in the aristocratic snob sense.
Right.
I should just add this, that there is a long tradition of people who have high rank in society glomming onto classical education and then using it to distinguish themselves from from, let's say, from the working class. That's not Christian classical education. That's a corruption. That maybe it's pagan classical education, but it's not Christian classical education. So back to the question, I realize now I just made a distinction that's pretty important, because classical education begins with the Greeks and the Romans, right? And so why is there Christian classical education? Why did the Christians absorb it? And the answer to that briefly is because between the 2nd and 5th century, the Christian community did a very deep analysis of what the Greeks and Romans believed and held on to what was worth keeping, and then really processed it and reinterpreted it. For example, by the 7th century, there wasn't really anybody in Europe worshiping Zeus,
right,
or Jupiter. So that wasn't. It's still probably, well, it might be becoming a risk again, but not very much. I have never encountered. I teach Homer a lot, and I've never encountered that the kids end up worshiping Zeus. Right. The Greek gods aren't appealing once Christ is revealed. But what we can do is we can look at Homer's writings, for example, and learn a lot about the human spirit. We can learn a lot about vanity. We can learn about how to process anger. We can learn practical things. If we're reading the Odyssey, we can see that the Odysseus begins on the island of Calypso and has to get away. And the opposite of Calypso is Apocalypso, and that's the last book of the Bible, the Apocalypse. And so the Odyssey actually is believed by many, including me, to be the initiation of a kind of literature called apocalyptic literature, in which the Lord is far away and he comes to his home and his own receive him not. And so he has to deal with the suitors and he has to take back his kingdom. So the book of Revelation is in the tradition launched, well, I won't say launched by Homer, but that Homer is a big part of. And that's apocalyptic literature. To me, that's really, really fascinating. And so therefore we get an affirmation of the tradition by the fact that it's used in the Bible, just as Proverbs, for example, are a good thing to read, and the Bible validates that. But it's not saying everything Homer taught was literally true,
right?
But it's fulfilled, right? It's fulfilled in Christ, and that's what a Christian has to decide: is this text here my enemy, or does Christ fulfill it? Is this in conflict with Christ, or does Christ fulfill it? And my belief is that just as we ourselves, we are in conflict with Christ until we humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord. And then what does he do? He lifts us up. He doesn't crush us.
Right.
And in a similar way, if Homer or Plato if the text is humbled before the Lord, then the Lord doesn't destroy it and toss it aside. He fulfills it. He purifies it and purges it. And that I know I'm personifying, but that's what Christian classical culture, that's what Christian classical education does, is it purges and purifies and lifts up the Homers and Platos and Aristotles and Virgils of the world.
So this is interesting because there are many, many Christian schools out there. I hesitate to say most of which, but probably most of which are not classical. They're basically just mimicking the conventional education paradigm, but they're adding, a Bible class or chapel on Wednesdays or that sort of thing. What, in your view, is the problem with Christian schools just copying the conventional education model?
Which is such an interesting way of putting the question. What is the problem with Christian schools copying the conventional education model? People come to us and say, why, as a Christian, are you copying the classical model? Okay, so why would you copy the conventional? Where has it proved itself? What has it done well? Right? And I would say the problem with imitating the conventional model is that it's rooted in a fragmented, materialistic, nihilistic, if not atheistic, view of reality. The very idea that you can fragment subjects and just grab, I'll put it this way. If you walk into, if you're in 9th grade in a conventional school, you're going to sit in your history class, have a history teacher, and read a history book. at the end of which a bell will ring. You will close the history book. You will leave the history classroom and leave behind the history teacher, walk down the hallway, which will separate you from history, and go into, let's say, a science lab or a literary class even. And in the literary class, there will be a literature teacher. And you will sit in a literature class desk and pull out a literature book. I remember one time, my first year as a teacher in a classical school, the students had never been in a classical school before. I was teaching in literature class, I was teaching Shakespeare, and I mentioned the Elizabethan theater and the background, the context, the historical context. And one of my students said, "Mr. Kern, you can't do that." And I literally had no idea what she was talking about. When I say literally, I mean literally in the old-fashioned sense. I had no idea what she was talking about. And I said, "Can't do what?" And she said, "This is literature class." And I said, "Huh?" She said, "You're talking about history." "Yeah, you can't talk about history in literature class." And what I wondered was, who told her that? And I would wager that nobody ever said those words to her. What taught her that was the fact that she went to history class, opened a history book, and then closed it and left it behind. She was taught to think in a fragmented, broken way, which Christ doesn't do. Christ is the Logos. He is the unifying principle of all reality. And to teach children in the conventional mode is to teach them a functional, practical, formal lie that they absorb into their souls, no matter how good your arguments are for apologetics. If what you're doing day to day is telling them the opposite of what you're telling them by words, right? If the form of your instruction is contrary to the content of your instruction, then they are absorbing into their soul a lie about reality. And so children, they're not taught postmodernism by, they don't become postmodernists because they're convinced. They become postmodernists because formally they were taught postmodernism by the fragmented, broken up curriculum. That's one it's big, but that's one instance or one element of conventional education that I absolutely and utterly reject. I'll just quickly throw out another one, which is age segregation. People forget that age segregation really only started in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was never done that I'm aware of before that, and it's based on the factory. What it's not based on, and how can I state this strongly enough? What it's not based on is two things: Christ the Logos and the soul of the child. Those two things are obstacles. Those two things are problems to conventional education. Not to mention the Holy Spirit. Imagine if you had to make space for the Holy Spirit in a conventional school. But the fact that the soul of the child is set aside for administrative needs, that is what drives conventional education. And that's what I was rejecting from the very beginning. Is I wanted to start with, how does a child learn, and what does Christ have to do with that? What is the fact that Christ is the Word, the Logos? What does that have to do with the training and education of a child's mind and soul? And so when you discard the soul of the child and you discard Christ, you get conventional education. So that is why I have to insist as strongly as I possibly can that a Christian school should not imitate conventional education. It should imitate classical education, because classical education respects the soul of the child. And then Christian classical education fulfills that by respecting Christ as the Logos.
So this is interesting because you give sort of this meta ethic, right, for why taking this particular approach to education as a Christian is very important. In my own work, I've been looking at a lot of the practical aspects, why this model has actually failed society, and I've seen it everywhere. I mean, the Acton academies, for example, they aren't Christian schools, although some of them are run as Christian schools. But one of the things that I've learned is that the conventional education paradigm has so tried to contrive let's get them from K through 12 into college. That's their next step. And so everything has been sort of, condensed into okay, they need to pass the tests, right? What does the college admissions officer want them to actually have in front of them? And now college admissions boards are saying these GPAs are meaningless. They don't actually reflect what they used to reflect, which was intellectual rigor and things like that. And so we're having to go back and say, this model has actually failed in a practical sense. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And universities, for example, are looking for something different. But even in the world at large, there are necessary skills like foundational reading, writing, critical thinking that is severely lacking. And it's actually lacking so much. I noticed that there are teachers who want to be able to teach skills like critical thinking and aren't equipped to do so.
Right.
Not only were they not taught, but there's no training or curriculum to teach them that. It's all, and it in part, I think it has to do with this sort of shortcutting that the conventional model does.
It's a good word for it.
But I do want to ask you the other question, since you mentioned it. Why should Christians copy the classical model?
Well, it depends what you mean by the classical model. I don't. Any model is just a model, right? So it's not reality. It's a model. There's a pattern and a structure, but within the classical movement, and I think of it as there's two things going on. There's a classical movement, and there's also a classical renewal. And the distinction I'm making is that in the classical movement, there's a lot of free riders. There's a lot of people who found that it's a good marketing thing and want to have some kind of cultural influence or whatever it is, some distracting thing. So they join this movement, but movements come and go. There's also a classical renewal taking place within that broader context of the movement. And in the classical renewal, people are really thinking through what it means to be a human being and how do you cultivate the humanity of your child, and how do you actually use education as a means of expressing love and blessing a person. And when you get into that mode of thinking, what you do then is you start asking, well, how has that been done historically? How has it been done within the church? How has it been done in other cultures? And the classical approach, and I prefer to say approach instead of model, because it's extremely flexible. In fact, you used the term shortcut earlier. And the word for shortcut in Greek, interestingly, is meta hodos. Meta means it's a preposition, so it can mean almost anything. But hodos means way, and meta hodos, methodos, means a shortcut. We get method from it. The idea is that if you can reduce something, now in the modern world, method has become industrialized. The idea is that if you can reduce something to a pattern, a repeatable pattern, a repeatable conduct of behavior, you'll get a predictable outcome. Like it's plastic in a machine, or something like that, or a puppy that you're trying to train. The child's soul is not methodical, right? It's not going to reach its fulfillment by method. However, there are modes, right? There are modes of instruction. And basically there are two, I believe, in the classical Christian tradition. One, at Circe, we call one mimetic. The other is commonly understood as Socratic. And mimetic instruction, you could call it parabolic or incarnational if you wanted to. Mimetic instruction is when let's say you want to teach a child what 2 + 3 is. Every parent knows you don't just get philosophical.
Right.
You incarnate it, right? You give them 2 plastic teddy bears and 3 plastic teddy bears, or 2 pieces of candy and 3 pieces of candy. And then they put them together. We call it manipulatives for some reason. What they are is incarnations. Okay? The thing that's being incarnated, the truth that's being incarnated, is the logos of the lesson. So in a mimetic lesson, you're incarnating a logos. And you can see that that's done for the 4-year-old in mathematical manipulatives, but it's done for the whole human race when the logos himself becomes incarnate and reveals God to us. So that's how the human soul perceives reality, is through a mimetic encounter, through an incarnation. So, and for example, right, a lot of people might be saying, "Can you give me an example?" Well, that's an example, right?
Yeah.
The very fact that you're saying, "Can you give me an example?" I won't say proves, but illustrates my point, right? That the way we come to see a truth is by seeing it embodied, by seeing it in a specific instance. And notice what I said there is I said it illustrates my point, because sometimes it's an example that we use, and sometimes it's an analogy or an illustration. So a fable, a folk tale, a fairy tale, a myth, all of these things become examples, but not literal. They become illustrations or analogies of some truth. And so you'll hear some people say sometime, "I don't read fiction because it's not true," or "I don't read fairy tales to my children because they're not true." They don't understand, biblically speaking, what truth is. Truth is constantly being embodied in stories. And fairy tales embody the truth of the human soul. Folk tales embody the truth of a culture and the soul in ways that no analysis and no nonfiction can possibly do. So we need examples and we need illustrations, examples and analogies. That's mimetic teaching. And then Socratic teaching is when you're trying to explain, let's say that 3 + 2 = 5, and the child concludes it's 6. And they just insist it's 6. And they're free. They are free people, so they can insist that it's 6. Unfortunately, if they do, they'll never be free again in math, because they'll never be able to calculate anything else.
Right.
They won't be free to go to the moon on a rocket ship. But if they insist that it's 6, one approach is you can start asking them questions. You can show them that in their own mind, there's an inconsistency. So that's what Socrates would do in the dialogues. And it's what a good teacher does a lot of, is when a student goes wrong, instead of scolding them or being impatient with them, you ask them how they got their answer. And it could be, as I said, 3 + 2 = 6, or it could be, "I'd like to be like Achilles," or it could be, the best guy in Shakespeare is Iago in Othello. That would be a mistake. The solution to that is not to correct them, but to help them to see, right? The goal is to help them to see. And the way you help them to see is by asking, "How did you get to that conclusion? And then, have you considered this?" Whatever, you ask questions to help them see that there's an inconsistency in their own mind. And that's where we're starting to talk actually about mental health. Because what our conventional schools are doing to children is mentally unhealthy. A mentally healthy mind is a coherent mind. It has an internal harmony, you see? And if you have inconsistent, incoherent thoughts in your mind, if you have enough of those, you're going to have a discordant mind. And that will cause you something on a range that moves toward mental illness, dis-ease. Okay, it could just be unease about an inconsistency, all the way up to mental illness. We are not created for, and we don't like discord. Yeah. And so what we teach our children in math class actually is not just math. We're teaching them how to resolve discords. We're teaching them how to bring peace to their own minds. When we teach them grammar, we are teaching them how to bring peace to a sentence. What is a sentence? It's a thought. So when we teach them how to bring harmony to a sentence, we're teaching them how to bring peace to their mind. If they make a mistake in math and literature, and we lead them to examining that mistake, not only are we correcting the mistake, but we're teaching them the habits of thought that lead to resolving discords that bring peace to their mind. And if you put them instead in an age-segregated classroom, which is socially incoherent, and in a curricular fragmented setting, which is intellectually incoherent, and then you teach them lessons that are all about nothing but immediate practical applications and what is somehow considered relevance, now you're becoming mentally incoherent. And what you're doing is teaching them habits of mental illness. Now, that doesn't mean that every child ends up mentally ill, thank God. Right. But it certainly increases the number of children who do. Yeah. And what we ought to be and can be doing is teaching them peace, harmony. And that's what Christ brings to our minds. And that's why the classical model, as you put it, I would say the classical modes of instruction, they're healing. They're
Mm,
just intellectually success. You can succeed in the academic realm or get a good job. Fine, but what if you're mentally ill when you do that? Right? What this does, it heals the mind when
yeah.
it's done with love and blessing.
So this is such an excellent point. I've made this point a number of times. First of all, when I teach critical thinking classes using the Socratic method, and I do it with adults. And the thing that I've learned is, well, I've learned two things. Number one, adults have a really hard time asking questions. And so we go through a process of learning how to ask questions, and we go straight back to just basic who, what, when, where, why questions. And they're usually floored about how in depth you can get into a conversation with a basic question, with very simple question. Yeah. But the one thing that I notice is they enjoy, like once they get into that process of reflective and critical thought, they have fun with it. And one of my former students said, this is like going to the gym. It's exhausting, but it's invigorating.
Yes.
And what I've noticed is, and I've also noticed this with kids, when you get kids thinking, you can see the light come on, and they get excited about it. They're excited about learning for the first time. And that then becomes a driver for them to pursue more because it's enjoyable. And I've pointed this out to people a number of times that when your brain is doing what it's designed to do, which is to think through things, even struggle through difficult questions, it's actually an enjoyable experience. You can even, there's a sensation to it. And the other thing that I've learned is that, and I finally have I've started to see some studies come out that, critical thinking, or I like to call it reflective thought, is literally healing for those who have gone through emotional or psychological abuse. Because it's rewiring the brain. It's helping you do something that you didn't do before. But it also helps you process through things that happened to you. And so it really is, when you said healing, it's really healing. And that's it's becoming empirically evident that is the case.
Right.
So yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, and if I may just quickly say, the word harmony, harmonia is the Greek word, but the notion of harmony is what they meant in the ancient world by health. Right. So if your body is in harmony with itself, you're healthy.
Yeah.
If your mind is in harmony with itself, you're mentally healthy. If you are in harmony with the people around you, you are in healthy relationships, right? And we as a culture have just accepted fragmentation and discord, but it's not healthy.
Right.
And so if we, and let me just add quickly, truth is coherent. One way critical thinking shows you're wrong because you're contradicting yourself. In other words, there's a discord between these two statements. If you can resolve that discord, you attain harmony. And because we don't like admitting we're wrong, we can resist that. But once we do admit we're wrong, and then we receive the correction, we attain harmony, that is the joy of learning.
Yes.
To the point where you'd said before, it's like a light goes on. Well, what's the word for that? Illumination, enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
Apprehension. We get it. It's the idea that some energy, some radiance has some flame has lit up in us. And that's objective. That's not just a feeling you get because your teacher's excited.
Right.
It is an objective reality because your soul loves the truth. You just participated in it, and it brought a greater degree of unity and harmony to your own soul. Yeah. All of those things lead to harmony, truthfulness, and thus wisdom and virtue, which if you go back to when we started our conversation, right? What's classical education? It's the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. That's why teaching a child subjects and predicates in harmony, 3 + 2 = 5, is cultivating wisdom and virtue and mental health and social health.
Yeah. There's one last question I want to ask you before we wrap things up.
Okay.
And this goes back to what you had mentioned about the conventional model. And please correct me where I'm wrong because I'm pulling this from my memory.
Okay.
But you had said something about how the conventional model is only designed to get kids ready for the economy, to fit into the economy. Um, in in Christianity, we have this concept of vocation, which is distinct from just job, right? Which is what we think of when we think of job training. We just got to get you it. You just need to make an income, right?
Yeah.
How does classical education connect what they're that training towards wisdom and virtue, and how that extends towards vocation?
Well, two quick comments. First, I would say that initially conventional education was ordered toward the economy, but as that became a failure, it shifted toward activism. And plus, the human soul needs meaning, and since there isn't any actual objective meaning in conventional education, you have to now just spin it out of thin air, and you become an activist. But the more specific response to your question about the Christian is, or about the classical, is that in the scriptures, the Lord teaches us that if we seek first the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, all these other things will be added to us. And I think that applies nowhere more clearly than in education. If your goal for your children is that they will get really good jobs, they might. Okay, they might, but all the other things that you could have done for them will be lost. If instead you strive to cultivate wisdom and virtue in them, Christ-likeness in them, the fullness of wisdom and virtue, then not only will they receive the kingdom of God because they seek that, but all the other things will be added to them. And not only that, but they'll have the wisdom to know whether the job they're going after is the right one. And they'll have the virtue to get the job they need. And I think people have to be very careful not to turn wisdom and virtue into subjective fantasies. Wisdom is hard-hearted when it needs to be. It's firm when it needs to be. It's disciplined and rigorous, but it's also receptive and open. It knows when to be water and when to be a rock. It knows when to be powerful and when to be weak, right? And to be able to do that, you're going to be able to get a good job if you have those qualities about you.
Yeah, exactly. So the Circe Institute provides a number of services. Do you want to explain what those are?
Well, sure. The main one I think that your community might be interested in would be our teacher apprenticeship. The great need of the age is training for teachers, finding teachers either in the home, right? Confidence for the homeschool mom or dad that they know confidently what they're doing, or professional training in the school. We don't get that in our normal growing up. And then when we go to teachers' colleges, we get lectured a lot. So we have a 3-year teacher apprenticeship for homeschoolers, professional teachers. We've even had priests and pastors do it. And it's coaching. You're going to be reading some hard books, but you're going to learn how to read them. You're going to write, and you're going to learn how to write, and you're going to learn how to teach. And then you're going to walk into a classroom with the confidence to teach them the 2 modes that I talked about earlier, mimetic and Socratic teaching. That's the Circe apprenticeship. Andrea Lipinski runs that, and she's just brilliant. We have 8 of them, and they're in different parts of the country. We also have conferences. Every year we have a summer conference. Often this year it's in Charleston, South Carolina. Next weekend we'll be doing one in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And then in the fall we're doing one in Dallas, Texas. We have 3 a year. The national conference and then 2 seasonal conferences. We also have online training. We have training for school leadership and training for teachers online, which people can find on our website, circeinstitute.org. We have a press. We do a whole bunch of other stuff, but we're trying really hard to focus. So those are the ones. Our Lost Tools of Writing is our writing program that teaches. Andrew Kern described it beautifully. He said it's a stealth teacher training program.
Nice.
So the Lost Tools of Writing is for a 9th grade student or down as far as 6 if they're particularly qualified or ready, in classical rhetoric.
Mm.
And that means teaching how to think. Critical thinking is a big part of it. Coming up with questions. A lot of it is asking questions before you write,
Yep.
and then how to write and how to refine your writing. That's called the Lost Tools of Writing. Again, if people are interested in learning more, they can see it on our website. That's the easiest initial contact. And please contact us if there's more questions. info@circeinstitute.org is a great place to go for any questions you have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, Andrew. Thank you so much for coming on. And we'll put all of the links to those things in our show notes so that people can find them very easily. So thank you very much. It was a joy having you.
Thank you.